Ma'am, you need to calm down! Get your hands off me!
Ma'am, stop resisting!
The moment that would change everything happened at 47,000 feet, and it didn't require a second thought. Flight 287 from Denver to Atlanta was nearing its final descent when passenger service manager Derek Holland decided that 28-year-old Sienna Mitchell had become a problem that needed solving immediately. Sienna was sitting in seat 140, a middle seat she had purchased because that's what her budget allowed. And she was minding her own business, listening to music through cheap airport headphones, trying not to think about the interview she had just bombed. What she didn't know was that the airline had overbooked the flight, and Derek had decided, without any algorithmic consultation, that she was the one who needed to go, not the elderly man in 14A who was sleeping soundly, not the overweight businessman in 14E who had spilled onto her armrest twice already. Sienna, a black woman traveling alone, wearing a thrift store dress with a crack in her phone screen, and a ticket that, in Derek's mind, meant she probably wouldn't make a fuss. That calculation would prove to be the most expensive mistake Pinnacle Airways had ever made. If you've ever wondered what happens when the powerless become powerful, when someone at rock bottom decides to take everyone else down with them, then Echo's story has brought you a story that will make you question everything you know about justice and revenge. Buckle up, because one phone call is about to change an entire industry. Derek approached Sienna's seat with the confident stride of someone who had ejected dozens of passengers without consequence. His uniform was crisp, his smile predatory, and his intention unmistakable. "Miss, I need you to gather your belongings and come with me," he said, his voice carrying the false politeness of someone delivering an unwelcome eviction. Sienna looked up, confused, pulling one earbud out. "What's the problem?" she asked, genuinely uncertain whether she had done something wrong. Derek leaned down, his voice dropping into the register reserved for people he considered beneath the airline's standards. "The flight is overbooked. We need you to deplane voluntarily. We're offering a $200 voucher and rebooked on the next available flight." Sienna shook her head, her hand starting to shake slightly. "I have a job interview in Atlanta on Monday morning. I can't miss this flight. I paid for this seat." Derek's expression hardened. The problem with people like Sienna, he believed, was that they didn't understand the hierarchy of air travel. A $200 voucher was more money than she probably made in a week. They should be grateful. "I'm not asking," he said, his voice dropping further. "You're being uncooperative. If you don't get up, I'll have you removed for safety violations." What happened next unfolded in the nightmare-like slowness of trauma. Two security officers appeared at Sienna's row, large men, trained to de-escalate, but willing to escalate if necessary. Sienna stood up, trembling, gathering her small backpack. She was cooperating. She was not being difficult. But as she moved into the aisle to follow Derek toward the exit, one of the officers grabbed her arm, not gently. His grip was possessive, painful. Sienna instinctively pulled away, which he interpreted as resistance. What happened next was captured on 4 different passenger phone cameras and would become the spark that lit the fuse. The officer twisted her arm, forcing her downward. Sienna cried out, a sharp, terrified sound that silenced the cabin. As she stumbled, her hip struck the metal corner of a seat armrest. The impact was severe enough to create an audible crack that might have been bone or might have been just the sound of her body hitting something unforgiving. She fell to the floor of the aisle, her dress tearing, her hand striking the carpet so hard that skin burned away instantly, leaving a raw, bleeding mark. The cabin erupted. Passengers gasped. A child began to cry. A woman in 14D covered her mouth in shock. But Derek and the security officers didn't stop. They grabbed Sienna under her arms and literally carried her toward the exit, her feet scraping uselessly against the carpeted aisle. Her screams echoing through an aircraft full of witnesses. Sienna was dumped at the gate without her luggage. It was still on the plane, still in the overhead bin above her empty seat, still in Denver, even though Sienna was now bleeding, bruised, sitting on the floor of gate B14, and sobbing so hard she could barely breathe. A gate agent, visibly uncomfortable, pressed a business card into her hand. "You can file a complaint with customer service," the agent said weakly. Sienna looked at the card, and something shifted inside her. It was 11:47 p.m. on a Friday night. Her interview, the reason she had scraped together money for this flight, was in 17 hours. She would miss it. She would lose the opportunity. And for what? Because she looked like someone who wouldn't fight back? Because her budget carrier ticket somehow mattered less than someone else's? Sienna pulled out her phone with her bloody hand, leaving a smear of blood on the screen. She sat in that empty terminal, her adrenaline fading, her pain becoming real, and she made a decision that would change her life forever. She called her cousin Lawrence, who worked in corporate finance for a major investment firm. "I need your help," she said, her voice hollow. "I need to know everything about Pinnacle Airways, everything, and I need to know who owns them." Lawrence, hearing the terror and anger in her voice, didn't ask questions. Within the hour, he had sent her a complete briefing. Pinnacle Airways was owned by a holding company, which was owned by a parent corporation, which had a CEO, but more importantly, it had just posted public documents about a merger it was planning. A hostile takeover defense was in the works, and the company had vulnerabilities. Over the next 3 days, Sienna did something that people in her situation rarely have the resources to do. She hired a lawyer, not with her own money she had. None but on contingency. Her lawyer, a woman named Patricia Gonzalez, who specialized in civil rights cases, looked at the security footage that Sienna had managed to obtain through requests to the airport, looked at the photographs of her injuries, and looked at the witnesses who were willing to provide statements. Patricia smiled a dangerous smile. "You have a case," she said. "But more than that, you have leverage." Patricia began making phone calls to journalists, to regulatory bodies, to the FAA. Within a week, the story of Sienna Mitchell had leaked to the media. "Passenger brutally removed from overbooked flight," screamed the headlines. Videos began circulating. The image of a young black woman being dragged off a plane while screaming became the symbol of everything wrong with an airline industry that had grown simultaneously more profitable and more abusive. Pinnacle Airways tried to contain the damage with a sterile public statement about safety protocols and passenger cooperation. The statement was tone deaf and infuriated people further. Stock prices began to dip. Customer service phone lines were flooded with calls from furious travelers, demanding refunds and cancellations. Inside Pinnacle Airways headquarters in Charlotte, North Carolina, the crisis management team was in full panic. CEO Leonard Hart was receiving briefing after briefing about what was happening. The incident had gone viral. 3 million views on one video alone. News outlets were running stories about systemic racism in air travel. about the power imbalance between airlines and passengers, about the specific pattern of overbooking practices that seem to disproportionately affect passengers of color. The board was calling, the FAA was asking questions. Federal regulators were looking into whether violations had occurred. Leonard Hart, a man who had built his entire career on controlling narratives and managing perception, realized that this was different. This wasn't something that would blow over with a formal apology and financial settlement. This was the beginning of something he couldn't control. He didn't know yet that he was watching the last days of his career in real time. He only knew that everything was slipping and he didn't have any way to stop it. But Sienna Mitchell wasn't just filing a lawsuit. Through her lawyer, she was doing something far more comprehensive. She was filing complaints with the Transportation Department. She was speaking to regulatory agencies. She was cooperating with journalists who were investigating the airline's practices. And most importantly, she was documenting a pattern. It turned out that Pinnacle Airways had a well-documented history of discriminatory overbooking practices. They had internal data showing that passengers of color were 3 times more likely to be selected for involuntary denied boarding than white passengers. They had records of similar incidents going back years. They had a culture of impunity because nothing had ever stuck before. But now, with Sienna's case getting national attention, with journalists digging into archives, with federal investigators requesting documents, it was all falling apart. The Department of Transportation opened a formal investigation. The FAA launched its own probe, and in a move that shocked everyone. The Justice Department opened a civil rights investigation into whether Pinnacle Airways had engaged in systematic discrimination. What nobody knew was that Sienna's phone call to Lawrence had set other wheels in motion. Lawrence, working through his investment firm, had begun quietly purchasing shares of Pinnacle Airways. Lots of shares. The stock was tanking because of the scandal, which meant the shares were cheap. Over 2 weeks, Lawrence and a consortium of investors he had quietly assembled purchased enough shares to gain significant influence over the company. More importantly, they had information. They knew about the overbooked flights. They knew about the discriminatory patterns. They knew about conversations Derek Holland had with his superiors about managing the composition of flights. They had evidence. At an emergency board meeting, Lawrence appeared, representing not just himself, but a consortium of investors who now held 9% of Pinnacle Airways and had the backing of major institutional investors who were disgusted by what the airline represented. He presented all of the evidence. He presented the pattern of discrimination. He presented the legal liability. And then he dropped the bomb. The shareholders are demanding change, he said. The CEO must go. The board must be restructured. Discriminatory practices must end, or we will sell our shares to our competitors, driving the stock to worthless. And we will pursue criminal charges under the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Your choice. Leonard Hart called an emergency press conference. He looked aged, hollowed out, his voice empty of the confidence that had defined him. Effective immediately, I am stepping down as CEO of Pinnacle Airways, he announced. The investigation into practices has revealed that I allowed a culture of discrimination to flourish under my watch. I take full responsibility. I am resigning without severance, without benefits, and with the sincere apology of a man who has failed his employees, his customers, and his company. Behind him, the board chairman announced that the entire executive leadership was being replaced. Within hours, federal investigators had served warrants on the executive offices. They were looking for emails, records, anything that proved deliberate discrimination. What they found was worse than anyone expected. There were internal documents showing that the discriminatory practices had been deliberate policy. There were directives from management suggesting that overbooking should disproportionately affect certain demographics. There were calculations about racial composition of flights. It was catastrophic. Criminal charges would follow. Civil suits would follow. But in that moment, what mattered was that the old guard was gone. Sienna Mitchell received a settlement offer that made her weep. $3 million for personal injury, pain, and suffering, and the violation of her civil rights. The airline accepted full responsibility. It agreed to overhaul its practices. It agreed to undergo mandatory diversity training. It agreed to implement new overbooking procedures that would be racially neutral and mathematically fair. The settlement was announced publicly. Sienna, no longer hidden, became the face of a revolution in air travel. She was interviewed on national news. She spoke about the fear, the pain, the humiliation. She spoke about how a system that was supposed to serve everyone had shown her that some people were considered more disposable than others. Her words resonated. They made people think about the power dynamics in everyday spaces. 3 weeks after Leonard Hart's resignation, the new interim leadership of Pinnacle Airways began making changes that shocked the industry. The first was a corporate restructuring that demoted Derek Holland from his position and removed him from passenger-facing roles. The second was a complete overhaul of overbooking practices. The airline announced it would no longer voluntarily deny boarding to any passenger. Instead, it would only overbook by a maximum of 2% and would be willing to pay much higher compensation to voluntary deniers. The third was a commitment to equity audits. Every quarter, the airline would review its practices to ensure that no passenger demographic was being treated differently from any other. These were radical changes for an airline industry that had built its profitability on exploiting the powerlessness of passengers. But Pinnacle had no choice. The court of public opinion had rendered its verdict, and it was damning that Derek Holland became personally liable for his actions. Sienna's lawyers filed a separate civil suit against him, suing him not as an employee, but as an individual who had conspired to commit discrimination. Derek, who had done these things to dozens of people before Sienna and thought there would be no consequences, discovered that there were consequences. His home was put in jeopardy. His savings, depleted by legal fees, disappeared. His family, facing media attention and public shame, began to fracture. He became a symbol of the abusive authority figure brought low, and in some ways he was. But he was also a symptom of a larger disease, a corporate culture that had normalized abuse and discrimination because no one had ever fought back before. Sienna had fought back. Sienna had won. And in doing so, she had exposed a system that would never be the same. Got federal investigators, emboldened by their findings at Pinnacle Airways, began investigating other airlines. What they found was a pattern. Every major airline had evidence of discriminatory overbooking practices. Every major airline had disproportionately affected passengers of color. Every major airline had normalized the kind of behavior that had been captured on video from Flight 287. The aviation industry was facing a reckoning. Congressional hearings were scheduled. Senators grilled executives. The FAA implemented new rules. The Department of Transportation issued directives that would fundamentally change how overbooking was handled across the entire industry. Sienna Mitchell, a woman who had been bumped from a flight because someone thought she wouldn't fight back, had inadvertently triggered a revolution in passenger rights. The new CEO of Pinnacle Airways was a woman named Victoria Chen, a former federal prosecutor who had spent 15 years prosecuting civil rights cases. She walked into the airline with a mandate to change everything. The first week, she fired everyone in upper management who had been involved in the discrimination. The second week, she began hiring aggressively from communities that had been historically excluded from the airline industry. The third week, she announced a profit-sharing initiative where 10% of all company profits would go to staff pilots, flight attendants, ground crew, everyone. Airlines are communities, Victoria said in a town hall meeting broadcast. To every facility, if we want to build a community based on dignity and equity, everyone in it needs to have a stake. That's not charity. That's enlightened self-interest. When people feel valued, they provide better service. When they're treated with dignity, they extend dignity to others. The stock market was skeptical at first, but then something unexpected happened. Customer satisfaction scores went up. Operational efficiency improved. The stock price, which had plummeted during the crisis, began to recover. Pinnacle Airways, rebuilt on principles of equity and dignity, became profitable in a way the old exploitative model had never achieved. Victoria Chen, along with the new board, flew to Atlanta to meet Sienna Mitchell in person. They sat in a room without cameras, without lawyers, just four executives, and one woman who had changed everything. I want to apologize, Victoria began, not as a legal strategy, not as damage control, but as a human being who has spent her career fighting the kind of discrimination that happened to you. What you experienced should never happen to anyone on an airplane or anywhere else. We're going to spend the rest of our existence making sure it doesn't. Sienna, who had been steeling herself for more corporate speak, heard something different. In Victoria's voice, she heard genuine remorse. She heard a person who understood the weight of what had happened. I didn't do this to hurt the airline, Sienna said quietly. I did it because I was hurt. I did it because I was angry. I did it because no one had ever told me that I had any power at all. Victoria reached across the table and took her hand. You did more than that. You showed an entire industry something it desperately needed to see about itself. That took courage. I'm grateful for your courage, even though I know it came from trauma. A year after the incident, Sienna Mitchell was hired by Pinnacle Airways as a consultant on passenger equity. Her job was to review practices, identify areas of potential bias, and recommend changes. She worked 3 days a week, making good money, respected by people who had once thought her disposable. But more importantly, she was using her experience to change the system from the inside. Every overbooking scenario that arose, Sienna was consulted. Every training program for staff, she helped design. She became the institutional memory of what could go wrong when power was abused. She also became a speaker at industry conferences, telling her story, explaining to flight attendants and gate agents what it felt like to be on the receiving end of their decisions. She was transforming her trauma into wisdom that could protect others from the same fate. Other airlines, watching what happened to Pinnacle Airways, and seeing the legal and financial consequences, began voluntarily implementing similar changes. Overbooking policies were reformed across the industry. Diversity initiatives accelerated. Training programs were overhauled. Passenger complaints were taken seriously. It wasn't because the airline suddenly developed a conscience. It was because they didn't want their own Sienna Mitchells, their own catastrophic exposures, their own CEO resignations and DOJ investigations. Fear drove compliance. Fear drove change. Not ideal, but effective. The aviation industry, notorious for its arrogance and indifference to passenger welfare, was being forced to modernize its relationship with the people who paid its bills. Sienna's story became a rallying cry for a broader movement about power and dignity in corporate spaces. Workers in other industries, hospitality, customer service, transportation began using her case as a reference point for how to push back against exploitative practices. Her name became shorthand for standing up to powerful institutions that assumed they could mistreat people with impunity. She received speaking invitations. She was offered book deals. She was approached about consulting for other companies trying to transform their cultures. She was invited to speak at universities about civil rights and corporate accountability. A woman who had been deemed disposable by an airline had become an authority on dignity and equity. 2 years after Flight 287, Shannon boarded a flight on Pinnacle Airways not as a passenger being removed, but as a consultant being welcomed back. The staff knew her story. The pilots knew her story. The gate agents knew her story. She was treated like what she actually was, the person who had forced the entire airline to confront itself and come out better on the other side. As she settled into her seat, a first-class seat they had upgraded her to without her asking, she looked around the cabin at the diversity she saw in the crew, and the uniform policy that now included options for wearing natural hair, in the visible respect that staff extended to every passenger regardless of their appearance or demographics. The flight was to Los Angeles, where she was going to speak at a national conference on civil rights in corporate America. The captain came out to greet her personally. "Ms. Mitchell, I want you to know that your story changed how I do my job." He said, "I think about you every time I make a decision about passenger treatment. You made us better." Sienna smiled. She didn't feel the need to cry anymore when acknowledging her trauma. It had been processed, integrated, transformed into something that mattered. The flight climbed to cruising altitude, and Sienna opened her laptop to review the speech she was going to give. In it, she was going to talk about the moment she decided to fight back, about the surprising power of one person refusing to accept injustice, about the way that personal trauma can become a catalyst for systemic change. She was going to quote, "The data showing that discrimination in aviation had decreased measurably since her case." She was going to talk about the other passengers who had come forward with their own stories, emboldened by her example. And she was going to conclude with this: "I didn't set out to change an industry. I set out to get home. But when I was stopped from doing that unjustly, I decided that someone had to pay for it, and I was right. But the payment I extracted wasn't just financial. It was a payment in terms of conscience, culture, and consciousness. An entire industry had to look at itself and ask if the way it had been operating was acceptable. The answer was no. And that answer came from one person in one moment deciding that their dignity was not negotiable. You all have that power. You all can be Sienna. You all can be the catalyst for change. It just takes one phone call, It just takes one person refusing to be disposable. It just takes one person saying enough. The plane flew toward the West Coast, carrying one woman's story that had become everyone's story. Echo's story brought you this tale of how the powerless become powerful, how one moment of injustice can trigger systemic transformation, and how the person you think is disposable might just be the most important person in the room, if you felt the power of this story. Please like and subscribe to Echo's story for more tales of justice, transformation, and the courage it takes to fight back against powerful institutions that assume they can mistreat anyone with impunity.